The morning of Malcolm's funeral was clear but bitter, the kind of cold New Mexico air that bites the skin, no matter how many shawls you wrap around yourself. I sat in the first pew of the chapel, hands folded over a handkerchief, already damp, watching the pine casket as though it might open and release him back to me. My husband had always been restless in life, walking ridges with his survey maps, tapping a pen against his thigh whenever he thought hard. Now he was still too still, and I could not reconcile that stillness with the man who had carried me through 40 years. Friends spoke kindly. They called him reliable, quiet, steady. I nodded through their words, polite smiles cracking at the edges, because only I knew the weight of his silences and the way his eyes sometimes looked past me as if he were keeping a secret too heavy to share. By the graveside, the wind carried desert dust into the prayers. I clenched the rosary in my pocket, its beads warm from my palm, and whispered one last goodbye. Thaddeus stood beside me, tall, immaculately dressed, a figure of control. He did not take my hand. He did not bow his head. When the casket was lowered, he simply adjusted his cufflinks and told the mortician he would handle the estate details. 2 days later, we gathered in the oak-paneled office of Mr. Salazar, the family attorney. The scent of old leather and stale coffee filled the room, and my heart pounded as if preparing for a verdict. Thaddeus sat across from me in a navy suit, his wife Marcella perched beside him, the pearls at her neck gleaming. She would not meet my eyes. Mr. Salazar cleared his throat. The will of the late Malcolm Crowhurst is straightforward. He glanced at his papers. To his son, Thaddeus Crowhurst, he leaves the family residence in Santa Fe, all investment accounts and holdings valued at approximately $200 million. My stomach clenched. The words blurred. And to his wife Adelina Crowhurst? His pause felt cruel. He leaves the 1998 Ford Crown Victoria and his personal belongings. The silence that followed was unbearable. Thaddeus's jaw tightened, but he did not look surprised. Marcella shifted slightly, as if she had expected this outcome all along. My cheeks burned as I forced myself to nod. Clutching the manila envelope Mr. Salazar slid across the desk. When I opened it, the car's title lay folded inside. Taped to the corner was a small brass key, the kind that belonged to no house I recognized. Beneath it, in Malcolm's uneven script, were 6 words: "For when you're truly alone." The paper trembled in my hands. I pressed the envelope closed before anyone else could see and forced my lips into something resembling gratitude. Mother Thaddeus said finally, smoothing his tie, "I'll arrange for the house staff to help you pack. It's best you relocate quickly." I wanted to ask him if he had rehearsed the line, if compassion had truly withered from him, but my throat refused sound. Instead, I stood, offered Mr. Salazar a weary thank you, and left the office. In the parking lot, the Crown Victoria waited. Its paint was dull, its roof spotted with sun damage, but it was mine, the only thing mine. I ran my fingers over the worn steering wheel, slipped the brass key into my coat pocket, and inhaled the faint smell of Malcolm's aftershave, still lingering in the upholstery. For the first time since his death, I felt a strange pulse of resolve, as if Malcolm had left me not just with scraps, but with a path, one I would have to walk alone. I turned the ignition. The engine coughed awake, and I steered toward the horizon where the Sangre de Cristo Mountains rose, wondering what door my husband had left me to open. The house felt colder after the will was read, as if the adobe walls themselves had understood I was no longer their mistress. For 40 years, I had polished the copper pots in that kitchen, dusted the carved vigas overhead, and watered the rose bushes Malcolm planted outside our bedroom window. Now, I moved through the rooms like an intruder. Thaddeus arrived the next morning, his polished shoes clicking against the saltillo tiles. He carried a leather briefcase, though he rarely visited without one, as if even in his mother's home he had to look like a man closing a deal. "Mother," he began setting the case on the dining table. "I've spoken with the staff. They'll help you transition smoothly. You'll want to be out by the end of the week." I stared at him, clutching a coffee mug, gone lukewarm. "Out. The estate needs clarity," he said evenly. "I'll be moving in with Marcella, and we're preparing renovations. It will be simpler for everyone if you relocate. Perhaps closer to town, a condo. It's time to move on." His tone was surgical, stripped of tenderness. The son I once read stories to beneath the cottonwood tree now looked at me like an obstacle to be managed. Marcella stood a few steps behind him, her hands folded in front of her pearl-colored blouse. She avoided my eyes, studying the floor, as if a stray speck of dust fascinated her. I searched her face for solidarity, even pity, but found only discomfort. "I'll need more than a week," I said softly. He gave a tight smile. "Of course. 10 days, then." I wanted to scream, to demand how a son could exile his mother from the house where she had raised him. Instead, I swallowed the words. My dignity was the only thing I had left that couldn't be signed away in a notary's office. Later that afternoon, as I carried linens from the closet to a suitcase, I passed Thaddeus's study. The door was half open, voices spilling out. I slowed my steps, the weight of folded sheets against my chest. "She's too proud to fight," Thaddeus was saying, his voice smooth. "The car is all she has. That's our leverage. By the time she realizes it, the rest will be secured." A man's voice, likely one of his lawyers, murmured in agreement. My throat tightened. They weren't speaking of grief or family-only strategy, as if I were an adversary to be cornered. I pressed my back against the wall until the conversation faded. Then I walked to my room, closed the door, and sat on the bed. For the first time since Malcolm's funeral, I allowed myself to cry not for him, but for the living. That night, I packed with mechanical precision. Dresses folded into 2 suitcases. Malcolm's rosary tucked into my handbag. A shoebox of photographs tied with twine. Everything else, I left the porcelain dishes from my grandmother. The leather chairs Malcolm loved, the oil painting of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains. All of it would now belong to Thaddeus. When the suitcases were loaded into the Crown Victoria, I lingered at the threshold of the house. The roses outside the window had begun to brown their petals, curling in the dry air. I plucked one, pressed it between the pages of my prayer book, and locked the door behind me. The car's engine coughed before settling into its familiar rumble. I glanced once at the mansion silhouetted against the fading sun. It looked imposing, like a stranger's house. I tightened my grip on the wheel, slid my hand into my coat pocket, and felt the brass key resting there, as if Malcolm himself had placed it anew. I drove away without looking back, the desert road stretching before me, carrying me toward a future I could not yet see. The first night away from the mansion, I slept in a modest roadside inn on the edge of Santa Fe, the kind of place where the carpets held the smell of old tobacco and the walls were thin enough to hear the neighbor's television. I lay awake, listening to the hum of passing trucks, clutching the brass key in my hand. Its edges dug lightly into my palm, a reminder that Malcolm had left me something beyond humiliation. I only needed to find out what. The next morning, I parked the Crown Victoria beneath a cottonwood tree in the motel lot. Its once proud burgundy paint was dulled by sun, and the trunk bore the scuffs of decades. I opened it to load my suitcases more carefully, determined to make space for what little I still owned. The smell of old leather and faint oil rose from the lining, strangely comforting. As I shifted boxes, I noticed the carpet in the trunk didn't sit flush. A corner of the felt was lifting, curling upward, as if it had been peeled before. I pressed it down, but it sprang back, revealing the outline of a panel. My heartbeat quickened. Malcolm was meticulous. He never left things undone. I tugged the lining away and discovered a small, recessed hatch, metal edges scuffed but secure. My hands trembled as I reached into my pocket, pulling out the brass key. Its teeth glinted in the morning light. I knelt, slid it into the lock, and with a firm twist, the mechanism clicked. The sound echoed louder than it should have in the quiet lot. The hatch opened to reveal a steel box, dull with age, yet solid. I lifted it carefully, surprised at its weight, and set it on the trunk's lip. For a long moment, I only stared, afraid of what I might uncover. Then I drew a breath and unlatched the clasp. Inside, a stack of documents rested bound with a leather strap. On top lay a faded survey map, edges worn and dotted with Malcolm's neat handwriting coordinates, ridges and notations in his familiar shorthand. Beneath it were official deeds, each stamped and notarized, naming Malcolm as the owner of over 400 acres of land outside Silverton, Colorado. My lips parted as I traced the lines. I had never known he owned anything there. Beside the papers were 3 old iron keys, heavier than they looked, each etched with strange carvings. One bore a cross-like figure, another a circular sunburst, the third a lattice of lines I didn't recognize. They clinked together as I lifted them, their cold weight unsettling in my palm. At the bottom of the box lay a sealed envelope, cream-colored and fragile with age. My name was written across the front in Malcolm's steady hand. Adelina, do not open until ready. The words struck me like a blow. Ready for what I traced the letters with my fingertip, imagining him sitting at his desk, choosing each word with care, certain I would one day stand exactly where I was. The envelope felt heavier than paper. Alone should allow, as if it carried not just ink, but intention. I set it back gently, resisting the urge to tear it open. Malcolm had been a cautious man, and his note was not written lightly. Perhaps inside were instructions, perhaps confessions, or perhaps only riddles. Whatever it contained, I sensed it would change the shape of my days as surely as the will had. I closed the box, tucked it beneath the trunk carpet again, and lowered the lid until it latched. My reflection stared back from the dull, paint-lined face, weary eyes. A woman stripped of her home, but handed a mystery in its place. Sliding into the driver's seat, I gripped the wheel and felt the brass key still warm in my pocket. The road ahead was uncertain, but Malcolm's secrets were waiting, and I could no longer pretend they weren't meant for me. The map weighed on me like a secret burning through its paper. 2 days after I discovered it, I packed my belongings back into the Crown Victoria and drove north. The road curled away from Santa Fe's adobe walls, carried me through stretches of high desert, where the sky seemed endless, and then rose steadily toward the Rockies. By the time I reached Silverton, the air had turned sharp and thin, a mountain wind that whistled through the car's old seals. Silverton itself was a town that looked both proud and weary. Its clapboard houses leaned against the slopes, and its streets bore the marks of miners and tourists alike. I stopped at a diner where the bell over the door jangled when I entered. The waitress, a woman with silver hair pulled into a braid, served me coffee and asked what brought me to town. My husband used to spend time here, I said, carefully. Malcolm Crowhurst, surveyor. Her eyes lit faintly with recognition. I remember a man with maps always spread on the counter. Quiet type. Folks said he walked the ridges every summer. Some thought he was hunting silver again. I nodded, though my throat had tightened. Malcolm had never told me of summers here. He'd called them work trips, necessary contracts. Hearing otherwise from a stranger felt like being introduced to a husband I only half knew. Following the directions on the deed, I drove past town, climbing a dirt road that wound through spruce and pine. The car strained, but carried me until the trees broke, revealing a clearing. There, sagging against the hillside, stood the shack. Its roof was corrugated tin rust spreading like rot, and its porch tilted as if tired of holding itself up. I stepped inside cautiously. The air smelled of dust and damp wood. A cot slouched in one corner, a broken stove in another. Sunlight filtered through cracks in the walls, striping the floor. At first glance, it was nothing more than an abandoned shelter. But my husband had not left me deeds and maps for a pile of timber. I moved slowly, running my foot along the warped planks until one gave slightly beneath my weight. Kneeling, I pried at the edge and found a seam. The iron key with the cross-shaped carving came to mind. My hands shook as I inserted it into the small lock hidden beneath the dust. The tumblers shifted, reluctant but obedient, and the trapdoor creaked open. A draft of cool earth rose to meet me. I found a lantern hanging nearby, struck a match, and lowered myself into the space below. The cellar was shallow stone walls bracing the soil and lined with wooden shelves. On them rested journals stacked in neat piles, their spines labeled with dates, reaching back nearly 20 years. Beside them lay canvas sacks filled with ore samples, each tagged in Malcolm's handwriting. I opened one journal and found precise sketches of ridgeline's depth measurements and annotations about quartz veins. Another listed assays of tourmaline marked in neat tables. The ore samples themselves caught the lantern light streaked with glints that shimmered like hidden stars. I traced his handwriting with my fingers, every loop and mark familiar, yet strange in this new context. Malcolm had spent years cataloging, measuring, guarding. He had not been wandering aimlessly in summers away from me. He had been recording evidence of something vast. I replaced the journals gently, heart pounding in my chest. My husband had built a life beside me of quiet evenings and steady work, but beneath it, he had built another life here, one of secrets, minerals, and patient watchfulness. When I climbed back into the shack, the lantern's glow fading behind me, I felt the weight of those journals pressing on my conscience. Whatever Malcolm had uncovered, it was no small thing, and now it lay in my hands to protect. I spent 2 days in the shack poring over Malcolm's journals until my eyes blurred. They were orderly, meticulous, the kind of record-keeping he had always done with our bills, except these pages tracked something much more dangerous. Coordinates, assay values, estimated yields. It was all there, but what unsettled me most wasn't the numbers. It was the ledger tucked between 2 volumes smaller than the rest, its cover plain brown leather rubbed soft with years. Inside, neat columns listed dates and payments. Each entry bore initials TM. Beside them were amounts that staggered me, thousands of dollars at a time, sometimes repeating monthly. My husband had always told me he was cautious with money, yet here was proof of large sums moving through unseen channels. I pressed my palm to the page, whispering his name as if he might appear to explain himself. That night, I couldn't sleep on the sagging cot. The silence of the mountains pressed too heavily. I needed a voice of reason, someone who had known Malcolm outside the life I shared with him. My thoughts turned to Father Alaric Dunn, the archivist priest who had baptized Thaddeus, and who, unlike most, had shared long talks with Malcolm about maps and history. He was older now, well into his 70s, but his mind had always been sharp as flint. The next morning, I drove the Crown Victoria back down the winding road toward Silverton's stone church. Its bell tower leaned slightly, as if bowing under the years. Father Dunn was in the garden, pruning roses with gloved hands. When he saw me, his face softened with recognition. "Adelina Crowhurst," he said, voice gravelly with age. "I heard of Malcolm's passing." "I'm sorry, my dear." I thanked him quietly, then held out the small ledger. "I found this among his things. I don't understand what it means." The initials TM. Do they mean anything to you? His brows knit as he adjusted his spectacles and studied the page. He was silent for a long time, the breeze rattling the leaves around us. Finally, he closed the book with care and handed it back to me. Tobias Marrow, he said. And the name alone sent a chill through me. A fixer. I knew of him decades ago. He worked in the shadows for mining firms, buying silence, smoothing permits, keeping men in line. If your husband was paying him, then Malcolm was closer to something significant than he ever let on. I gripped the ledger tighter. What kind of man was he, Dangerous Father Dunn replied. Men who tried crossing Marrow disappeared. Some were found in canyons. Others were never found at all. He thrives where law and greed meet Adelina. If Malcolm had dealings with him, it means Malcolm carried knowledge that powerful people wanted buried. The priest's words hung in the air like smoke. I thought of Malcolm's note on the envelope. Do not open until ready. And my chest tightened. He had lived with this weight for years, never breathing a word to me, and now the burden was mine. Father Dunn placed a hand gently on my arm. Whatever you do, guard these papers. Do not let them fall into the wrong hands, and be careful who you trust. Even your own blood can be tempted when such stakes are involved. I nodded, though my stomach knotted. The thought of Thaddeus flashed through my mind, his eagerness to push me out his whispers of leverage. Was he already sniffing around what Malcolm had left? I left the church with the ledger pressed against my chest, the mountains casting long shadows over the road. As I drove back toward the shack, the old car rattling with every turn, I realized Malcolm had kept me ignorant, not out of neglect, but perhaps out of protection. Still, the question gnawed at me, had he shielded me from danger, or had he left me as the final pawn in a game I barely understood? The journals sat heavy in my lap, each page a confession from a man who had loved me and lied to me in the same breath. I needed clarity, not only about Malcolm's choices, but about what exactly he had left hidden beneath the soil of Silverton. Numbers and sketches on a page could mean anything. I needed someone who could strip away the mystery and tell me the truth. Through Father Dunn's connections, I was introduced to Dr. Callista Orick. She was younger than I expected, 41 at most, her dark hair tied in a braid that swung when she walked, her boots scuffed but steady. She wasn't employed by any corporation, the priest assured me, but freelanced sometimes for universities, sometimes for stubborn ranchers fighting to prove their wells weren't poisoned. A reputation for integrity clung to her name, and that was enough for me. We met at the shack 2 days later, the air brisk with the promise of mountain rain. She spread my husband's ore samples on a canvas cloth like a jeweler, laying out precious stones. With a jeweler's loupe pressed to her eye, she examined each piece carefully, tapping them against her teeth, scratching them against a ceramic plate, weighing their heft in her palm. These aren't just pretty rocks, she said, finally setting one down with care. This is commercial-grade quartz. And here, she held up a green shard that glinted when the sun caught it, tourmaline, of unusually high quality. If these samples came from your land, Mrs. Crowhurst, then you're sitting on something companies would fight tooth and nail to control. Her words settled like lead in my stomach. And by companies, I said slowly, you mean the kind that don't ask nicely? She looked up, her eyes sharp and unflinching. Mining firms circle like vultures when they smell opportunity. They'll offer you sums that feel life-changing, then take 20 times that in profit. And if they can't buy you out, some will pressure you to sell through lawyers' courts, or worse. I pressed my hands together to stop their trembling. Worse has already knocked on my door. She raised a brow but didn't press. Instead, she began gathering the samples back into their sacks, labeling each carefully with pencil. If you hold the mineral rights, you hold power. but power is exactly what makes you a target. Whoever your husband was dealing with, I'd wager they already know what's here. You'll need to decide if you want to expose this to the world or bury it deeper than it's ever been." Her words echoed Malcolm's silence over the years. All his summers away, all the notebooks meticulously hidden, the key taped to an old car title. He had chosen secrecy over comfort, silence over confession. Callista brushed her palms against her jeans and gave me a measured look. "I can draft a preliminary report, something academic. It won't be bulletproof, but it will confirm the viability of these deposits. You'll need that if this ever goes to court, or if someone tries to muscle you out." I thanked her, though gratitude felt too small a word. She packed her instruments, shouldered her satchel, and paused at the doorway of the shack. "One more thing. Keep your eyes open. Deposits like these. Word travels fast, even when you think you're alone." Her warning lingered in the air after she left. I stepped outside a few minutes later, the journals clutched tightly to my chest, and froze. At the far end of the clearing, half shielded by the tree line, a black SUV idled. Its windows were tinted dark, concealing whoever sat inside. The engine purred steadily, not the sound of a lost hiker or a curious local. I stood in the doorway, my breath quickening. For a long moment, no one moved. Then, as if aware I had spotted them, the SUV shifted into gear, rolled back onto the dirt road, and disappeared around the bend without haste. I stayed rooted on the porch long after the dust settled, the journals digging into my arms. Someone already knew, and the game Malcolm had played so carefully was no longer his to manage, it was mine. I had barely unpacked a suitcase at a small roadside motel when the knock came. The sound was brisk, almost impatient. When I opened the door, Thaddeus stood there, polished in a tailored suit, as though he'd just stepped out of a boardroom, not driven miles into the mountains. His tie was loosened, but his eyes were hard. "Mother," he said, the word stiff on his tongue. "We need to talk." I stepped aside, though my chest tightened. He walked in, glancing at the faded curtains, the dented nightstand, the cracked linoleum. His lip curled as though he couldn't believe his mother was staying in such a place. He didn't sit, only stood near the bed, adjusting his cufflinks with deliberate precision. "Let's be plain," he said. "I know Father left you something. Some worthless plots of land, some papers you're clinging to, as though they matter. Sign them over and I'll make sure you're taken care of. Refuse, and you'll find your little pension vanishing into thin air." My throat burned, but I forced my voice steady. "Your father left me an old car. That was all." He smirked, stepping closer. "Please. You think I don't know about the shack? About the deeds you've been busy driving around like some detective? Whatever is hidden up there, it belongs to the estate, and that means me." I stared at him, searching for the boy I once knew, the child who used to grip my hand at crosswalks, afraid of the traffic. But the man before me was a stranger. Sharp-edged, ambitious eyes, flickering with something like desperation. "I won't sign anything," I said at last. The words landed between us like a stone dropped in water. His jaw clenched, and he leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Think carefully, Mother. This isn't just me you're defying. People are watching. People who don't take kindly to delays." It was then I understood. The greed in his voice wasn't entirely his own. He was parroting someone else's threats, carrying their urgency. Tobias Marrow's shadow stretched longer than I had realized. "You've let yourself be cornered," I said quietly. "Whatever deals you've made, whatever promises, you're not speaking only for yourself." Thaddeus's nostrils flared. "I'm trying to protect what's mine." "No," I said, rising to face him. "You're trying to protect what they've dangled in front of you, and you're willing to sell your mother's dignity for it." For a moment, his composure cracked. His eyes darted toward the window, toward the parking lot, where Marcella sat in their sleek sedan. I caught only a glimpse of her profile, stiff and pale, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She didn't look up, didn't meet my gaze, but something about her posture told me she knew more than she admitted. Perhaps she feared what her husband had gotten tangled in. Perhaps she feared me. Thaddeus straightened, smoothing his jacket as though brushing away doubt. "You'll regret this," he said. "Every penny you have depends on me now." I let him go without another word. He strode out, shoulders rigid, and the door slammed behind him. Through the thin curtain, I watched Marcella glance up at him as he climbed into the car. She reached for his arm lips, moving in what looked like a warning. He yanked his arm free, started the engine, and the sedan rolled away, its taillights shrinking into the dusk. I sat on the edge of the motel bed, my hands trembling, but my resolve firm. Malcolm's journals, the ore samples, the deeds, they weren't just scraps of paper. They were the line between truth and whatever hungry thing had sunk its claws into my son. And if I didn't guard them, I would lose not just the land, but Thaddeus himself swallowed whole by forces he thought he could control. I rose before dawn the next morning, too restless to sleep after Thaddeus's ultimatum. The shadows of his threats lingered in the room, pressing against the peeling wallpaper, whispering through the hum of the motel's radiator. I knew then that keeping the journals and deeds hidden under my bed would not be enough. I needed something stronger than secrecy. I needed walls of paper and ink shields Malcolm himself had trusted once. That thought led me to Donovan Reyes. He had been a friend of Malcolm's since their younger days, back when both men were cutting their teeth on dusty contracts and surveying claims in forgotten corners of the Southwest. Donovan had retired from notarial work years ago, but his reputation was untarnished, his memory still sharp, and his sense of loyalty unshaken. I found him in a small adobe home on the outskirts of Santa Fe. His garden was wild with chili plants and sunflowers, and he greeted me at the gate with a weathered smile. "Adelina Crowhurst," he said, voice slow and deliberate. "If you're on my porch this early, you've got trouble worth writing down." Inside, over coffee laced with cinnamon, I laid out Malcolm's deeds, the ledger, and the journals. Donovan read silently for a long while, his finger tracing signatures, his lips moving as he tested the words. When he looked up, his eyes were grave. "These papers are valid," he said. "The land is yours. But validity isn't protection. A hungry lawyer can twist gaps into openings, and your son's threats won't be idle for long. We need to build walls, legal ones." With his guidance, I filed preventive annotations at the county office that very day, blocking any attempt to mortgage or sell the properties without my signature. Donovan also drafted a trust under my name, placing the survey rights and deeds within it, naming me sole trustee. It wasn't armor of steel, but it was paper armor, thick enough to make the greedy stumble. As the documents were stamped and notarized, I felt a weight lift even as another pressed down. For every layer of defense I built, I wondered how many more Malcolm had hidden and why he had chosen to cloak everything in such secrecy. That question pressed harder the next evening when I remembered the second iron key. Its bow bore a small engraving of a chalice, one I hadn't recognized at first. But in the flickering light of my motel lamp, it came back to me, the same chalice carved into the wood of Father Dunn's parish doors. The next morning, I went to the church. Father Dunn received me with his usual gentle patience, though his eyes narrowed at the sight of the iron key. Without a word, he led me down the narrow stone steps into the sacristy. At the far end of the room stood an old oak cabinet with brass fittings, its lock worn by decades of use. The key slid in easily, turning with a satisfying click. Inside, amid ledgers of baptisms and marriages, sat a small lockbox. I lifted it onto the table, my pulse hammering, and opened it to find a neat stack of envelopes bound with twine. Each bore Malcolm's handwriting. On top, lay one marked simply Survey Rights Silverton. Inside, folded and notarized, were the original documents granting him mineral rights to the 400 acres. These weren't copies, weren't drafts. They were the crown jewels, the proof that no matter what Tobias Marrow or Thaddeus tried, the land was rightfully mine. Beneath the rights rested another envelope addressed to me, unopened, its paper yellowing at the edges. I traced my name with my fingertip but did not break the seal. Instead, I set it gently aside. Malcolm had layered protections like a mason laying stone. And still, one key remained in my possession, heavy and waiting. I had not expected the final key to open my eyes not to a lockbox or a map, but to the people closest to me. Sometimes betrayal is a document waiting in a drawer. Other times it is flesh and blood, breathing beside you at the dinner table. The first whisper came from Donovan. He called me late in the evening, his voice low, as though someone might be listening on his end of the line. "Adelina, I saw your daughter-in-law downtown today." She wasn't shopping. She was stepping out of the Plaza Hotel with Claudine Muro. The name froze me. Muro was counsel for Cerro Ventana Mining, a conglomerate with a reputation for swallowing small claims like minnows. If Malcolm had hidden his discoveries, it was because of people like her. The next morning I drove into town. I told myself I only needed to prove Donovan mistaken, that Marcella had been meeting a friend, maybe a relative passing through. But as I parked near the plaza's brick facade, I saw them myself. Marcella, her blonde hair coiled neatly at her neck, sat across a glass-topped table from Claudine Muro. The lawyer was striking in a severe charcoal suite, a woman who radiated sharpness like a blade. Marcella leaned forward, her manicured hands clutching a pen as Muro slid a folder across the table. Their heads inclined close, conspiratorial. I stood behind the shelter of a potted juniper, my pulse hammering. I didn't confront them then. I waited heartsick until Marcella left. I followed her at a distance as she returned to her car. She sat inside for a long moment, gripping the wheel as though steadying herself before driving off toward the house that was no longer mine. Later that evening, I called at the mansion. Thaddeus opened the door. His tie loosened his eyes, weary. Behind him, Marcella appeared, tension etched in every line of her face. I asked for a private word, and Thaddeus reluctantly allowed it. We sat in the drawing room, where I had once read bedtime stories to him, where Marcella and I had once laughed over recipes. Now the room felt cold, stripped of memory. "I saw you today," I said to her, "with Claudine Muro." Marcella stiffened her gaze, flickering toward Thaddeus, who frowned. "What is she talking about?" he asked. She swallowed hard. "It's not what you think." But it was. And I pressed on. "She handed you papers. You leaned in like conspirators. What deal are you chasing at my expense?" Marcella's voice cracked, but her words came with practiced firmness. "We have debts, Adelina, more than you know. The house, the cars, the investments, they're slipping away. Claudine says if we sign over those mountain acres, everything will be forgiven, wiped clean. Do you know what that means? We could breathe again." Thaddeus's face turned ashen. "Marcella." She pressed on, eyes glistening. "You don't understand what it's like watching everything unravel. Your mother is clinging to land she doesn't even need. But for us, it's salvation." I stared at her, remembering the woman I once called daughter in every way but name. I had defended her when Thaddeus quarreled with her, welcomed her into holidays, placed Rose's brooch into her hand the year she married my son. Now she spoke of salvation in terms of selling what Malcolm had safeguarded with his life. "You would sell my dignity for your status," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Marcella's eyes flicked away. "It's not about status, it's about survival." "No," I replied. "It's about wanting to stand above others, no matter the cost." The silence that followed cut sharper than any argument. Thaddeus looked between us, his jaw tight, as though realizing too late how deeply he'd been maneuvered. I rose without another word, leaving them in that gilded cage of a room. As I stepped into the night air, the weight of betrayal pressed heavier than the mountain stones themselves, and yet beneath that weight, I felt the faintest ember of resolve. If Marcella thought me weak, she had underestimated me just as much as Thaddeus had. The shack had never been welcoming, but when I returned the next morning, it felt violated. The door hung slightly ajar. The lock splintered where a boot had forced it open. Inside, the air carried the sharp smell of damp earth and muddy boots. My lantern lay overturned. Its glass cracked, and the floorboards bore smears of dirt where intruders had dragged their weight across the room. I steadied myself against the doorframe, listening. Only the wind moved through the broken seams of the roof. Whoever had come was long gone. The trapdoor was open. My heart lurched, but I forced myself down into the cellar. The shelves were in disarray, journals, scattered ore samples spilled from their canvas sacks. But when I reached for the wooden box where the survey rights should have been, my hand met only the decoys. I had left photocopies with faint watermarks Donovan had prepared. The real documents were safe with him, locked behind his notarized seals. I exhaled shakily, relief mingled with anger. Whoever had broken in had expected me to be careless. They had underestimated how much Malcolm had already taught me, even in silence. I spent hours restoring order to the cellar, stacking the journals, sweeping away the mud. Yet, no matter how I straightened the shelves, the violation lingered. Someone had touched what was mine, rifled through what Malcolm had left. I could almost hear his voice, reminding me to stay ahead, to think 3 steps forward. That evening, while I was loading boxes into the Crown Vic, a pickup rattled up the dirt road. Ezra Gallo climbed out, wiping grease from his hands with a rag. He was 29, wiry, with a mechanic's steady patience and a neighborly loyalty I'd come to trust since arriving in Silverton. "Mrs. Crowhurst," he said, holding up a small device. "Trail cam caught something last night. Thought you should see." He set the camera on the hood of my car and scrolled through the images until one froze my breath. Headlights glared across the clearing, and there, unmistakably, was Marcella's silver Lexus idling in the dark. The timestamp read just after midnight. My hands tightened on the hood until my knuckles ached. "You're sure?" I whispered. Ezra nodded, his brow furrowed. "Plates match." She didn't stay long, 10 minutes maybe, but long enough to snoop around. I closed my eyes, the weight of betrayal pressing anew. Marcella had not only spoken with Claudine Muro, she had driven all the way into the mountains to pry into Malcolm's secrets herself. And likely she hadn't come alone. The muddy prints had been too heavy, too many. She'd brought help. "Do you want me to take this to the sheriff?" Ezra asked. For a moment I considered it. But then I pictured Thaddeus already ensnared by promises he couldn't fulfill, and Marcella whispering poison into his ear. If the law got involved, the scandal would spread like wildfire, and my family's name would be dragged through every headline. "Not yet," I said quietly. "Keep the footage safe. If I need it, I'll ask." Ezra studied me a long moment, then nodded. "Be careful. Folks who drive up here at night aren't looking for friendship." When he left, I sat behind the wheel of the Crown Vic, the trail cam still in my lap. The night pressed close around me, heavy with unspoken choices. To expose Marcella would be to burn every bridge with my son. To stay silent would invite more shadows to creep into the shack. I tucked the camera into the glove box and turned the key in the ignition. The engine coughed awake, and I drove into the dark, knowing I could not keep balancing between silence and retaliation. Forever. The courthouse in Durango was a stone building that seemed to carry the weight of centuries. Its tall windows let in pale morning light that fell harshly across the benches and the long oak tables. I sat at one of them with Donovan beside me, his hand steady on the stack of documents we had prepared. I carried no lawyer's briefcase, only Malcolm's worn survey bag at my feet, its leather cracked and softened by decades of use. Across the aisle, Claudine Moreau stood sleek and confident, her charcoal suit pressed to perfection. At her side, Thaddeus sat stiff, his jaw tight, as though he barely recognized me as the woman who had raised him. Marcella, elegant but pale, avoided my gaze. The proceedings began quickly. Claudine strode to the bench, flashing a smile sharp as glass, and held up a document. "Your Honor," she said smoothly, "we present here a property assignment executed by Mr. Thaddeus Crowhurst, rightful heir assigning all mineral interests inherited from his father to Cerro Ventana Mining. Witnessed at a formal event signed of his own free will." The judge adjusted his spectacles and studied the paper as Claudine continued her words, polished like practiced theater. "This establishes that Mrs. Crowhurst has no remaining claim beyond what she was already allotted a vehicle. The estate by law and by the intent of the heir belongs with my client." I sat motionless, but inside my chest, my heart pounded. Thaddeus's eyes darted briefly toward me, then away, shame flickering before pride smothered it. He had signed something he didn't even understand at a cocktail party, no less, and now Claudine was waving it like scripture. When it was our turn, Donovan rose with the solemnity of a man who had sworn truth his whole life. He placed our bundle on the bench. "Your Honor, here are the original notarized survey rights mineral deeds and a trust instrument filed under Mrs. Adelina Crowhurst's name, each stamped and sealed prior to Mr. Crowhurst's death. No assignment can supersede a trust of this nature." The judge flipped through the papers, his face unreadable. Donovan pressed on. "Furthermore, preventive annotations were filed to prevent any encumbrance without Mrs. Crowhurst's consent. Any attempt to transfer rights outside that framework is null." For a long moment the room was silent, but for the shuffle of pages. Claudine's lips tightened. She leaned forward, whispering to Thaddeus, who shifted uneasily in his seat. Finally, the judge cleared his throat. "The trust documents are in order. The court recognizes Mrs. Crowhurst as the sole trustee and rights holder. The assignment presented by Cerro Ventana is invalid and unenforceable. Case dismissed." The gavel struck a sound that rang through me like the first deep breath after drowning. Claudine's composure faltered just for a heartbeat. Her mask cracked and her eyes blazed with fury. She gathered her papers sharply, whispering something to Marcella, who looked as though she might shatter under the weight of it. I rose slowly, gathering Malcolm's bag, and left the courtroom with Donovan. Outside, the mountain air was cool, and the sky seemed impossibly wide. Yet even as I savored the small victory, I knew this was not an ending. Claudine's kind did not retreat. They regrouped. Back at the motel, I set Malcolm's survey bag on the bed, my fingers brushing over its weathered flap. Something caught against my hand, a hidden pocket I hadn't noticed before. Inside, folded neatly, was a single slip of paper. The handwriting was his, steady and familiar. The third key is for what I could not face. I sat frozen, the note trembling in my hands. Whatever Malcolm had buried it was more than land, more than minerals, more than money. It was a truth he had been too afraid to confront while alive, and now it was waiting for me. The note burned in my pocket for 2 days before I found the courage to act. The third key is for what I could not face. The words lingered with me while I walked the narrow streets of Silverton, while I lay awake staring at motel ceilings. Malcolm had left me puzzles. Within puzzles, each one leading deeper into a story he had never dared to tell. At dawn, on the third morning, I drove back up the mountain road to the shack. The forest was quiet, the air sharp with pine and melting snow. I walked around to the rear where the slope rose steep and rocky. Malcolm's old survey sketches guided me lines marking a crude square 20 paces from the back porch, beside a half-buried boulder shaped like a kneeling man. I dug with a rusted spade until the metal rang against something solid. Clearing away soil and roots, I uncovered an iron chest, its surface corroded but intact. The lock bore the final engraving, a sunburst. My hands shook as I fitted the third key into place. It turned with a grinding click. Inside lay not gold or jewels, but stacks of paper sealed in waxed sleeves. At the top was a charter for a community education fund, written in Malcolm's steady hand and signed in ink I recognized as his. It spoke of scholarships of training programs for minors' children, of turning mineral wealth into something lasting for generations. Beneath it rested sample contracts with royalty clauses, agreements that would funnel percentages not to corporations, but to schools, hospitals, and community trusts. I felt tears rise unbidden. Malcolm hadn't chased fortune for himself. He had been planning a shield away to transform the earth's hidden riches into something that could not be devoured by men like Tobias Marrow. Beneath the contracts sat a small flash drive encased in a plastic sleeve. I carried it back inside the shack, set up my old laptop, and waited as the screen flickered to life. The video began abruptly. Malcolm sitting at a desk, his face older than the man I remembered. Lines cut deep into his cheeks. His voice was steady, but weary. If you're seeing this, Adelina, then I am gone. And it means the walls closed in faster than I could push them back. He paused, adjusting his glasses. I've kept too many secrets from you thinking I was protecting you. But the truth has a way of finding its way through. He lifted a folder into view pages, rustling. I kept records. Marrow paid off officials to bury permits. Claudine Murrow funneled money through shell companies to buy silence, and he hesitated, his voice faltering. Thaddeus, our son. They groomed him, fed him luxuries, debts, promises. He took money. He may tell himself it was loans, favors, but it was bribery. They have him in their pocket. My chest constricted as if the mountain itself had pressed against me. Malcolm leaned forward, eyes burning into the camera. If you expose this, you'll bring them all down. But you'll bring him down, too. I couldn't face that while I lived. I couldn't destroy my own son. That is why I left it to you. Forgive me. The screen went black. I sat there for a long time, the hum of the laptop filling the silence. The chest still gaped open beside me, its papers spread like fragile wings. Malcolm had built every protection he could, but the final decision, the unbearable choice, he had left in my hands. Outside, the forest shifted, a raven's cry cutting through the cold air. I closed the chest, locked it again, and held the key tightly in my palm. Whatever came next, I would have to decide not only how to guard Malcolm's legacy, but whether to sacrifice my son to preserve it. The flash drive had left me shaken, but it also gave me direction. Malcolm's map showed one shaft circled 3 times in red ink, a note scrawled beside it. Core samples stored here. If his records in the shack weren't enough, those samples would prove the land's true value beyond argument. Proof mattered now more than sentiment. That night, under a moon veiled by clouds, I drove with Dr. Callista Oric and Ezra Gallo up the rough switchbacks toward the ridge. The Crown Vic groaned on the incline, but it held steady, as if it knew it carried more than passengers. It carried secrets. We left it at a clearing and hiked the last half-mile on foot, lanterns dimmed to slits of light. The entrance was where Malcolm's map said it would be, a collapsed wooden frame leaning over a dark mouth in the hillside. Rotting beams sagged like broken teeth, but the shaft itself yawned wide enough for us to slip inside. The air was cold, damp with the smell of stone and rust. Our footsteps echoed in the hollow space as we moved deeper past old timbers and rusted rails that once guided carts of ore. My lantern beams swept across the walls, catching flecks of quartz that winked like eyes. Here, Auric whispered, kneeling near a side alcove. Wooden crates, dusty but intact, were stacked against the wall. She pried one open with a rock. Inside, wrapped in waxed paper, lay cylindrical core samples. Stone drilled clean through revealing veins of quartz, shot with green tourmaline. She ran her fingers over them reverently. This is it. Malcolm wasn't exaggerating. These deposits are far larger than anything in the journals. My chest tightened with both pride and fear. He had been right all along. But proof could be as dangerous as gold. We loaded several samples into Ezra's pack, careful not to take more than we could carry. Just as I closed the crate, a sound cracked through the silence, a boot scuff against stone. My lantern trembled in my hand. From the shadows emerged 3 men faces masked with dark cloth. One carried a crowbar, another a pistol that gleamed faintly in the lantern light. Well, the one with the pistol, said voice, muffled. Looks like the widow's gone prospecting. My heart slammed against my ribs. Auric froze, clutching a core sample as if it were a shield. Ezra shifted slightly, his jaw tight, his eyes darting toward the ground. The man with the crowbar stepped closer. Hand it over. All of it. Now. I felt Malcolm's bag heavy at my side, the chest key still inside. I couldn't let them strip everything. My hand itched to reach for the papers, but Ezra's voice cut in smoothly. All right, he said, raising his hands. No trouble. Just don't point that thing at the lady. He bent as if to set down his pack, but in one motion kicked over a rotted timber. The beam crashed against the wall with a thunderous crack, sending dust and rocks cascading from the ceiling. Startled, the masked men flinched, ducking from the falling debris. Run, Ezra shouted. We bolted down the shaft, stumbling over rails and stones. Behind us, curses echoed, then the sharp clang of boots chasing. But Ezra knew the tunnels. He veered left into a narrow passage that led upward, the walls scraping our shoulders until we burst into the open night air. We collapsed in the brush, gasping. The mine's mouth glowed faintly with lantern light as the men searched inside, their voices, angry but growing fainter. Ezra wiped the grime from his forehead and gave a grim smile. They'll know we have proof now. I clutched the core sample against my chest, its edges cold and unyielding. The battle Malcolm had warned me of was no longer hidden in ledgers or courtrooms. It had stepped into the dark with weapons in hand. The morning after the mine, I knew I could not keep drifting between shadows. Proof was in my hands now, core samples, survey rights, Malcolm's charter, and with it came responsibility. If I left it buried, men like Marrow would circle until they stripped me bare. If I sold to vultures, Malcolm's vision would be twisted into greed. I needed an ally strong enough to fight, but honest enough to honor his dream. Through Donovan's contacts, I found them. Breckham and Holt, a Denver firm, known for working with ranchers and tribes who had fought off predatory mining companies. Their reputation was not flawless. No firm's ever is. But they had built schools in the very towns where their contracts struck ore. The meeting took place in a quiet boardroom on the 12th floor of a glass tower, far from the dust of Silverton's trails. Auric sat beside me, her hands steady on the samples. Donovan had brought the trust papers. Across the table, 2 partners listened as I outlined Malcolm's vision. A fund to educate miners' children. Royalties channeled directly into community projects, a contract structured so the land would remain in my trust's name. When the draft agreement slid across the polished oak, my throat tightened. $12 million up front. Royalties for every ton extracted earmarked for community schools. Oversight written into the charter, impossible to erase without a judge's hand. At the bottom, a space for my signature. I traced my finger over the heading, the Malcolm Crowhurst Education Fund. My husband's name would live not in secret ledgers or hidden shafts, but on the walls of classrooms where children would learn to read and dream beyond the mines. Tears pricked at my eyes, but I held the pen steady. Just as I lifted it to sign, the doors burst open. Thaddeus stormed in his suit, wrinkled eyes, bloodshot desperation carved deep into his face. Marcella hovered behind him, pale as porcelain. He slammed his hand on the table, scattering papers. "You can't do this," he said, voice ragged. "That land, those rights, they should be mine. Your father left them to me," I said quietly. His laugh was brittle, broken. "You don't understand. I owe them. Millions. Loans markers deals I thought would pay off. If you sign this, I'm finished. They'll come for me." For the first time in months, I saw not arrogance in his eyes, but terror. My son cornered, drowning in debts he had thought would lift him high. The partners watched in silence, their expressions unreadable. Donovan's hand tightened on the stack of contracts, holding them steady against the storm. "Thaddeus," I whispered, "they already own you. Don't let them take me too." His jaw worked as if he were fighting back tears, but his voice cracked into anger. "If you ever loved me, you'll give me this chance." I looked at him, then really looked the boy I had held when he scraped his knees, the man who had shut me out of my own home, the son who now begged me to surrender everything Malcolm had safeguarded. Love and grief battled in my chest, but above them, both rose something else, dignity. I set the pen against the paper. "I do love you. That's why I won't let you drag this legacy into the pit you've dug." And I signed. Thaddeus staggered back as if struck. Marcella touched his arm, but he shook her off, his face crumbling. He turned and fled the room, his footsteps echoing down the corridor. Silence lingered. Then Donovan slid the contracts into a leather case, his eyes glistening with quiet approval. The deal was sealed. Malcolm's name and my dignity had been bound into something no creditor could seize. Yet even as relief washed over me, I knew the battle for my son was not finished. The first snow of winter lay thin over Santa Fe's cemetery, whitening the stones and softening the silence. I stood before Malcolm's grave, the letters of his name carved clean into granite, my breath curling in the cold. Beside me, Thaddeus shifted restlessly, his shoulders hunched against the wind, though the tremor in his hands came from something deeper than weather. "I brought you here," I said, my voice low but firm, "because this is where truth belongs. Your father gave his life to protect a vision bigger than money, bigger than himself. I will not let you twist it into debt and ruin." Thaddeus's eyes flickered toward the stone. He looked younger, there stripped of his suits and bravado. His jaw clenched, as if he were still that boy afraid of letting his father down. "You have a choice," I continued. "You work for the fund with humility, or you walk away with nothing. No inheritance, no share, not even my name to lean on. You want salvation? Earn it by serving others, not yourself." For a moment he said nothing, the only sound the distant cry of a crow. Then the dam broke. He sank to his knees in the snow, his voice raw. "It wasn't supposed to be like this." He sobbed. Marcella kept pushing new houses, cars, trips. Every time I said no, she called me small, weak. I thought I could outpace it. I thought I could gamble my way back. And then the debts piled, and Merrow's men came knocking. I couldn't stop it, Mother. I couldn't stop her. His confession cut me, not because of the debts those were his to carry, but because I had once trusted Marcella as my own. Now I saw how her hunger had dragged him under, and how he had let himself be pulled. I placed a hand on his shoulder, steady, but unyielding. "Blaming her won't absolve you. You signed. You threatened me. You betrayed your father's memory. If you want redemption, it starts here with your own choice." He looked up, eyes red and wet. "What do you want me to do?" I met his gaze, letting no weakness show. "At Christmas, when the fund is announced, you will stand before the community and apologize. Not to me alone, but to everyone you've wronged. You will speak of your greed, your mistakes, your shame, and you will pledge to serve the fund not as heir, but as servant. That is the only way forward." His shoulders shook, his breath ragged. "And if I can't, then you are no son of mine," I said, my voice like stone. The words hung heavy between us, but I did not flinch. He bowed his head, weeping into the snow, his tears carving small, dark patches in the white. I looked at Malcolm's grave, the silence of his name, and prayed that somewhere he heard me, and that the reckoning begun there would carry into the days ahead. The house was full again, though not with the weight of old bitterness. Pine boughs draped the banister, candles flickered in the windows, and laughter drifted from the kitchen where cousins and nieces stirred pots and fussed over pies. For the first time since Malcolm's passing, I felt warmth return to these walls. It was Christmas, and it was more than tradition. It was a reckoning. I stood in the parlor beside the tree, the ornaments catching glimmers of firelight. Thaddeus sat in a straight-backed chair, a folded paper trembling in his hands. His face was pale but resolute, the lines around his mouth etched deeper from weeks of strain. He looked up at me once as if seeking permission, and I gave him a single nod. He rose, clearing his throat, and began to read. "I stand here tonight, not as heir, not as son, but as a man who has failed. I betrayed my mother's trust. I threatened what my father built, and I let greed blind me until I could not see family or dignity. I am sorry. To all of you, to this community, and most of all to the woman who carried me into this world and never gave up, even when I gave her every reason to. I pledge myself to the work of the Malcolm Crowhurst Education Fund, not as owner, but as servant. I will work until I am worthy again." His voice broke on the last line, but he did not falter. He folded the paper, and from a box at his side, he lifted something wrapped in cloth. When he placed it on the table before me and pulled back the covering, my breath caught. It was my wedding. China delicate ivory plates, rimmed with silver long thought, lost after Malcolm's will was read, and the household divided. He must have searched for it, perhaps even wrestled it back from Marcella. Now it gleamed beneath the lamplight, a quiet symbol of restoration. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the room, but I could not speak. Tears blurred the edges of my vision. Thaddeus lowered his head and stepped back, waiting not for applause, but for judgment. I crossed the floor slowly and laid my hand on his arm. The strength in my voice surprised even me. "You have begun." Around us, family pressed close, voices rising again with cautious joy. Yet one figure was absent. Marcella had stood near the doorway when Thaddeus began, her face tight, her eyes shifting. Halfway through his words, she had slipped out silently, her heels clicking down the hall, the front door closing softly behind her. By the time I looked, she was gone, and I knew she would not return. The night carried on with food and carols, with children tearing ribbons and adults exchanging gifts. For once there was no shadow looming over the laughter. For once I let myself rest. I sat by the fire long after the house had quieted my hand, resting on the china, my son's apology folded carefully in my lap. Peace, however fragile, had settled over me. Yet as the embers dimmed, my thoughts turned again to Malcolm's flash drive still hidden in the desk upstairs. On it lay words not yet spoken, truths not yet faced. And I knew the peace I felt tonight might not survive what waited there. The days after Christmas passed in a fragile calm, but I knew the time had come to finish what Malcolm had begun. I could no longer keep the flash drive hidden like some forbidden relic. If his words were to mean anything, they had to be heard not by me alone, but by all those who stood to inherit the truth. On New Year's Eve, the community gathered at the town hall for the formal launch of the education fund. Banners bearing Malcolm's name hung above the stage, and children's voices echoed in the rafters as they sang carols before the speeches. I stood at the podium, the Crown Vic's keys in my pocket, and the flash drive clasped tight in my palm. When the time came, I cleared my throat. Before we begin this new chapter, I said, "You must hear my husband's voice one last time." The screen flickered to life. Malcolm appeared seated at his desk, the same recording I had watched alone in the shack. But this time, I let it play in full. One by one, the videos followed Mero, slipping envelopes across polished tables. Claudine Muro, accepting payments, masked as consulting fees. My own son. Younger, flush with pride, signing papers slid to him under the haze of expensive liquor. Each frame cut sharper than the last. The hall was silent, but for the hum of the projector faces, turned pale breaths held. Then Malcolm's voice again. "I could not protect the world, but I could protect my wife. If you see this, know she carries my trust, and in her hands lies the only weapon that matters truth." When the screen went dark, the silence broke, not with anger, but with a steady rise of voices, support, applause, even tears. The people saw not a fool who hid secrets, but a man who had sacrificed comfort to shield them, and a woman who had chosen to bear that burden after him. Thaddeus sat in the front row, his hands pressed hard against his knees. He did not move when the clapping began. Only when the crowd rose did he lift his head. Our eyes met, and in his gaze I saw the shattering of illusions. He understood then his father had foreseen his weakness, and instead of condemning him outright, had left me with the means to guard us both. Afterward, as night fell and lanterns lined the streets, I drove the restored Crown Victoria through town. Its engine purred with the steadiness of years, the upholstery carrying the faintest trace of Malcolm's aftershave. The new school stood near the square, its windows glowing with promise, the sign above the entrance freshly painted, the Malcolm Crowhurst Education Fund Academy. I slowed, lowering the window, and whispered into the cold air. I kept the car. I kept my name. And I kept the door open only for those who knock with respect. The road stretched on quiet and endless, as if waiting for whatever knock might come next.